Greetings from Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area. While reading about the history of the park in books such as Folklife Along the Big South Fork of the Cumberland River, one might begin wondering whatever became of some of these historic places. Well, protected within Big South Fork is Charrett Creek Lodge, dating back to the early 19th century, which still stands as a lasting reminder of a way of life that was once widespread in the region. We hope to see you at the park soon.
Hello, I'm Daryl Phillips, and I'm the host of this session. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of Humanities Tennessee, and thanks for participating in the Southern Festival of Books. So far, it seems to be virtually going off pretty well. If you're watching on Facebook Live or YouTube and you want to ask questions during the session, you will need to either download the festival app or visit the streaming site via the link at www.humtn.org/SFB. And I want to mention that Parnassus is our bookseller and that their purchases of the book via Parnassus help to keep the festival free. Humanities Tennessee staff will have the book buy links in the session at the top of the chat. The festival is a free nonprofit event that is supported in part by donations from individuals. If you appreciate the event and want to support it, you can do so by visiting the website at www.humtn.org. And they'll post the link for the donate page. Again, welcome to the Southern Festival of Books. And this session is, the author is Mary Bohlen with Heritage Cooking, inspired by Rebecca Boone. And it is I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It's more than a cookbook. It has a history of Rebecca Boone, and also the history of how people lived back in those days, and the heritage of our ancestors. So I know that you didn't tune in to hear me talk, so let's I'll introduce Mary, and we'll get started.
Hello, Daryl. Thank you so much for being with me this afternoon, and I look forward to our conversation. I want to tell you a little bit about the book. I worked on the book for probably 5 years, off and on, gathering materials from my colonial cookbooks, notes that I had made, photographs that I had taken. I've been doing open hearth cooking for 30 years, and I absolutely love it. I guess I would say that I found my niche. And I wanted to put this together, to put my experience together, and a collection of recipes or receipts that I have cooked over the years and the places where I've cooked them, and weave that into the story of Rebecca Boone. In the last few years, I've been cooking at the Whippoorwill Academy in Ferguson, North Carolina, at the Rebecca Boone Cabin. And over the years that I've been doing that, I've often thought of Rebecca. She actually lived approximately a mile from where the replica cabin now stands. And I was standing or as I stood at the fireplace or was gathering wood from the back porch, I would often think about her and what her life would have been on the upper Yadkin Valley in the mid 1700s. And so I put together a collection of my experience, the recipes that I've used. The recipes that are in the book are only ones that I have personally used at the hearth, and we wove that together with the story of Rebecca. And the reason that I really want to concentrate on Rebecca is because uh, a lot of people don't know who she is. She was the wife of Daniel Boone, and of course, we know Daniel Boone as a hero or an icon of colonial America who went through the Cumberland Gap and established settlements in Kentucky. What a lot of people do not know is that he lived a good portion of his life in North Carolina. And he and Rebecca were married in North Carolina and had 8 of their 10 children in North Carolina. And they lived for a good portion of time on the upper Yadkin River, very close to where I'm living now. And I wanted to focus on Rebecca because she is oftentimes left in the shadow of her husband, and there's not very much written about her. We don't know very much about her at all. We know that she was approximately the same height as Daniel. She had very dark hair and dark eyes, and I believe that she was a very strong woman. She knew how to do all the skills, the domestic chores around the cabin, around the frontier, and the farmstead. And if you can imagine, when Daniel left, when he went on his hunting forays, he would be gone for months at a time, sometimes years. She didn't know whether he was coming back or not. So I think Rebecca, for me, she's a hero. She's a woman, a very strong woman, a brave woman. She was skilled in doing a variety of things that we may not think as feminine activities, chopping wood, uh, shooting a rifle so that she could, get a deer or squirrel or turkey for meal for her table. And so that's I wanted to bring her to highlight her in the book. And hopefully people will imagine or can imagine what life was like on the frontier. And although we talk about Rebecca in the book, we also are reminded that she is just one of many, many women that had the same kind of life. Our grandmothers, our great grandmothers, had that same kind of life when they were moving to other places in the settlements, south or west, when our nation was very young. I also wanted to include in the book my experience, the places that I have cooked. Uh, Most of them are historic sites or campfire cooking. And I wanted to show that to my readers so that they could uh, experience that by going to visit some of these historic places and maybe even getting involved with some of the activities at these historic places so they could be a volunteer or so that they could develop colonial skills, whatever those skills might be. It doesn't just have to be open hearth cooking. So I included that in the book. And then I've included recipes. In the 18th century, they were called receipts. The word receipt is a very old term. It was used way back, even in the time of Chaucer, and it meant a list of ingredients or directions how to make something. It could be the directions how to make a food dish, or it could be for making medicines or combining herbs to make medicines. And so that is a term that was used up until the 19th century. I have looked at many manuscripts or books that are called receipt books or copy books. So that's an old term when we use the word receipt. It's equivalent to the word of recipe. However, today we think of the word, or we see the word receipt, and we think it's, that's what you get when you check out of the grocery store. And so it has a little bit different meaning today. What we mean by open hearth cooking, for those of you that may not be familiar with this, we're talking about cooking on the hearth, on a fireplace. Sometimes we call it camp cooking because you can do the same kind of cooking in the at a campfire. And so I've cooked at the fireplace, and I've also cooked on the campfire. There's a little bit different. The technique is still the same, but sometimes cooking in the campfire is a little bit different. And that the difference could be the weather, or the temperature outside, or the type of wood that you have. So in this book, I've also included some of the recipes that I've used, or the receipts. And Daryl, we've also got some pictures that we've brought with us, and I can tell you about some of these if you like. And if you want to ask me some questions about it, we can start there.
Sure.
All right, the picture that you see in front of you now is taken at the Tatum Cabin at Hickory Ridge Living History Museum in Boone, North Carolina. This was a picture that was taken in the summertime a couple of years ago, and the pie that you see is a peach pie. When I cook, I only cook foods that are in season for that particular geographic location. So we were able to get peaches at that particular time, and this is a peach that we cooked in front of the fireplace at the Tatum Cabin. The Tatum Cabin dates to about 1785 and was moved to Boone from a nearby location, and it's a place that you can go and visit today. Okay, this is one of the most interesting recipes that I ever made. It is a soup, it's pumpkin soup, and it is made with a candy roaster. A candy roaster pumpkin is oblong, like the shape of a large cucumber. And I peeled it and cooked it down and put cream with it, and some salt and pepper and a little bit of butter, and it's absolutely delicious. The candy roaster is an old mountain pumpkin. The picture coming up now is the Savannah Cabin at Foxfire in Mountain City, Tennessee. This is where I've cooked for several years. It's the Foxfire Museum, and this particular cabin was built in 1820, and I have cooked there, as I said, several times, and I think we're going to be seeing some pictures of me cooking at the fireplace there. Well, no, this picture is the Tatum Cabin that I just told you about a little while ago, that is in Boone, North Carolina. And it's a fabulous cabin. It's one of the most authentic cabins that I've ever been able to cook in. This is a picture of the Yadkin River. Daniel and Rebecca Boone lived close to the Yadkin River for many, many years. And this is a picture of the river in a place that is close to me. This is up on the upper Yadkin River. So you can see that the river is, at this point, is not very wide. The river continues to flow southeast. It flows into the PD River and on into through South Carolina and onto the Atlantic Ocean. But the headwaters of the Yadkin River are here close to Blowing Rock, North Carolina. This is the hearth of the replica Daniel Boone or replica Boone cabin at Ferguson, North Carolina, and you can see that we've got something in the pot at the base of the picture. When you cook on the hearth, you usually use Dutch ovens. The Dutch oven has little feet on the bottom of it and has a lid that has a lip on it, and you shovel coals out on the hearth, onto the hearth, and place your food, whether it's biscuits or a pie or cookies or bread, into the Dutch oven. Put the lid on the oven and then put hot coals on top. And so it's cooking from the bottom and from the top, much like your oven does at home. The trick is you don't know what the temperature is, so you really have to watch just make sure you don't burn it. And if the temperature goes down, then you need to add more hot coals on top. This is a recipe that I wanted to share with you. This is to fry sausages with apples. And I've used this recipe or receipt many times, particularly when we're doing campfire cooking, Revolutionary War, living history events. And this is an 18th century receipt from Hannah Glass and from Suzanne Carter. This recipe is great to cook over the campfire as well as the hearth. You use 6 cooking apples. I would probably use tart apples, and you can sort of do this as, as whatever is convenient for you. A pound of lean sausage, ground or link sausage. You could also, if you wanted to do this at home, you could also use something like kielbasa. And then you cook the sausage, and if it needs to be drained, then you can drain any grease off of that, and then mix in your apples. The apples up into 1/4 inch thicknesses and cook it in with the sausage, and it's very, very good. It's different, but this is a recipe that has a very variations to it. I remember when I was a little girl, my mother cooked bacon and sausage together, and we loved it. I'm sorry, bacon and apples together, and we loved that very much. But this is a really old receipt back from the 1800s and 1700s. The next receipt that I have for you that I wanted to share with you is Jane Knox Lattice Ginger Cake. I got this recipe from Latta Plantation, which is a little bit north of Charlotte, North Carolina. Jane Knox Latta was the woman of the house, and this was her handwritten receipt. And you'll notice in this receipt that she used lard. Today we can use Crisco, but actually I'm beginning to have an experience of going back to the lard. But either one that you wanted to use would be all right. And this works great cooked in the Dutch oven at the fireplace.
One thing that I wanted to point out, the recipes in the book, one of the things that I appreciated was it told how to do them on the hearth or the campfire, but it also gave some information about converting those to today's measures and to be able to do them in your kitchen if you wanted to.
That's correct. And one of the fascinating things about the old historical recipes is that oftentimes they are in measurements of pounds. 1 pound of sugar or a pound of butter or in ounces. And so to in order to use that even on the campfire or the fireplace, when I start gathering my ingredients for a receipt and I need a pound of flour or 2 pounds of flour, I have to be able to convert that for me into cups or into teaspoons or tablespoons. And that's a challenge, but that's a mathematical area that is great for teaching measurements for yourself or for school children.
Another thing about the book was, I mentioned before it's not just a cookbook, and I'm into history, and I appreciated the information about what Rebecca Boone's life was and her contribution to history, but also I thought about my ancestors, and they would have been doing things the same way, cooking on the hearth, and I think that, when I was reading it, I was struck by how much that men get into history more because they serve in the military or something like that. But it was no less significant. People like Rebecca Boone that fed the body and the soul of the family to keep things going.
That's very good, a very good point. When I think about Rebecca Boone, I don't think just about her, but I think about our great grandmothers who moved from one part of the country to another part of the country in a covered wagon, or just with a pack horse and items on the pack horse, and started a new life. One of the important things to have with you were your cook pots, and sometimes cooking was very simple. And I think in some cases, maybe for Rebecca, that with all the moving around that she did with Daniel, that her meals probably were very simple, but they were based on the availability of food. An example for that would be here on the Upper Yadkin River in North Carolina. There was plenty of deer, turkey, and bear that her older sons or her brothers or Daniel could have brought in for food. And a lot of times we don't think about some of the foods that they ate as something that we would want to eat, but they didn't have a lot of choices, and so bear meat could be made into bacon. It could be used as roast. You can or roast beef, or you could also render the fat in the bear to make oil. The Moravians used bear oil in some of their cooking, and we find that information from the Moravian archives. The Moravians were in Old Salem, which is approximately 60 or 70 miles to the east of where we are right now. But of course, you could make jerky out of the beef, whether it's a deer or venison, and then, of course, fish from the river, and those squirrels, and those sorts of things. And then you look at maybe some of the wild foods that were available here. Dock it was a green that could be used in the summertime or in the early spring. Nuts and berries that are plentiful in this area, blackberries or cherries or apples, those sorts of things. And that's what she would make her meals with. But she had a very large family, and it would require a large cook pot to provide the food for 10 or so people to feed. So I imagine that was something that was on her mind quite a bit as to planning, whether she actually did the cooking or not, or she maybe delegated that to one of her younger children to do. She had to do a lot of planning and preparation.
Well, and we'll be going into questions pretty soon. So if anybody out in the audience have any questions, please feel free to send those in to us. One of the things that you think of it being not a lot of flavors and kind of the same foods, but there's a lot of instances of like the pies and the cake, or what they call cakes, but we would call a cookie. I mean, unfortunately, I wasn't very smart and didn't have lunch before this, and I'm thinking about some of those foods that I saw on there, and so you might talk about some of the ways that they added variety to their food, and about the spices and things like that.
Oh, thank you. One of the things that I mention in the book are some of the things that would have been in Rebecca's larder, or they may not have been, depending on the availability of the different spices or additives to food, or whether they could afford it. Spices were very expensive and they were hard to get. All the most important spice, or the most popular one that people wanted, and we might not think of this today in our modern day, but pepper was the most sought after spice. That is so common for us today that's probably hard to imagine. But when you think also about cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, all of those had to be imported from the West Indies, or from Africa, or some faraway place. So by the time they got to the ports in Charleston or Boston, and they had to be brought overland on wagons. And by the time they reached the settlements in the frontier area, they were expensive. Now, you could probably get them, but whether or not you had the money to pay for them would be another issue. Most likely, I believe that some of these items were traded or bartered for, paid for with deer hides, or maybe vegetables or fruits, some sort of a barter system. But spices were hard to get. Another thing that was very expensive was sugar. It was also difficult to get because of the distance and then the expense of it. Another thing that we think of, or we think about molasses. Well, in the 18th century here in the colonies, molasses was not being produced. Now, when we talk about molasses, we're talking about sugarcane molasses that came out of the Caribbean area, the Caribbean islands. What we think of today as sorghum molasses did not begin to be planted and used here in the United States until about the mid 19th century. So even molasses had to be imported, and sometimes there were taxes on sugar or taxes on molasses. So one thing that I think the Boones used, or Rebecca, and probably a lot of other people like her, they were making their own maple syrup. Now, I have to tell you, I couldn't believe it. For a long time, I'd never imagined that maple syrup was made here in North Carolina. But in the 18th century, we had some extremely cold weather in the latter part of the 18th century, and you could make maple syrup here. In fact, I have a friend that lives toward the Tennessee border that makes maple syrup today. It's very good. And the Moravians were making maple syrup, so that's one reason that I think that the Boones were probably making it also.
And so, tell us a little bit about who they were and their connection with Rebecca
The
Boone.
Moravians, the
Mhm.
Moravians settled, came down from Pennsylvania, and around 1750, they came and made a settlement at Bethabara, North Carolina, and they were Germans from Moravia, and they came here and established a town called Old Salem. It's part of Winston-Salem today, but the Moravians were excellent record keepers, and they had diaries and journals and all sorts of documents that I can use, or that somebody who wants to do research on food items can go to today to find out what the Moravians had. And if the Moravians had certain items, it's likely that some of the other community people in the community could have had those items too. Like, we go back to the issue of whether they could afford it or not, because a lot of these farmers were just poor yeoman farmers and were living off the land and may not have had the extra funds to buy some of these items.
There's a question from the audience. Where can the Candy Roaster pumpkin be found today?
That is a pumpkin that you might find in the mountain communities. It is actually, it's a little bit difficult to find, but it's one of the best pumpkins that you could use. I would say look at farmers markets in the mountain areas, and I don't know of any other way that you could do that. It's a sweeter pumpkin. You almost don't need to use sugar in it, but it's an old mountain variety, and I hope that you check out your local farmers market.
I assume there's a photograph of it in the book. I don't recall.
You mean the candy roaster?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I don't think that there's a picture of the candy roaster in the book. The candy roaster is an oblong pumpkin. You wouldn't even think it's a pumpkin. It's oblong, like a big long cucumber, and they've got a funny shape, and I don't even know how. They're very different looking than what we would think of as a regular pumpkin today.
You've written other books, and tell us a little bit about the process of writing this book and your inspiration, and give us a little bit of insight of what it's like to be. I think a reader enjoys learning how a writer does the craft.
Sure. This was a long journey for me. I had thought about doing this for a long time, and I suppose I was in some ways I was my own worst enemy, because I didn't think that I had the confidence to get it done. But a friend of mine asked me to put together, or suggested that I put together, my experience and my cooking and tie it into Rebecca Boone. And I took her advice and I started working on it. I love to write, I love history, and I love researching the receipts in the book and how it all comes together. Uh, and it's a great way to teach children history and teach them about heritage cooking and the old ways back before all the modern conveniences. So I used some of my photographs that I had. I had notes that I had written, and I have a large collection of colonial books or reproduction books. So I put that together, and uh, I wasn't really sure how I was going to do it. And then I did the rest. I was inspired to talk about Rebecca Boone because she's an inspiration to me. She's an inspiration because she's she's a woman that's not recognized very much. She doesn't get the credit that she's due. She was strong. I think she was courageous. I think she had a tremendous amount of faith, and she was very committed to her family and to Daniel Boone. Can you imagine your husband going off for a year or two and not knowing whether he's dead or alive, or and carrying on the household day to day, picking up, the slack and not having a man around. She was either had to make the decisions or do it herself, and so she's an admirable person, and I wanted to give her the credit that I think she's due. And hopefully, through this book, people will be inspired to look more into colonial history or the history of women. And I also would like to think that this book will be an inspiration to other women that even at an older age, like I am, to be able to fulfill your dreams. Don't give up, keep going, and don't let age be a barrier.
Well, when we were talking earlier in the week, uh, you know, I learned so much about my ancestors, how that they, run the household, and I mentioned that I saw some similarities in Vivian Howard's book, and about, how significant food is in telling the history of it, and and how much a part of our life it is. And I mentioned that just last week that I made a apple pie using a skillet that my grandmother had used, and about how that made a connection. In the book, that feeling comes across. Talk about a little. Could you talk a little about how the connection of um, food is an expression of personality?
Well, of course, uh, cooks uh, put the ingredients in a dish that either they have or they make do with what they've got, or they may have their own personal preference. Some people can use they use a lot of spices in some of their dishes. Some cooks choose to not use so much, but you can take a recipe and make it your own. And I think that that's what many cooks do today. They'll put a little bit of this or a little bit of that, and a lot of times when I'm cooking it, I think about my mother, and mother didn't have recipes for certain things, and she just would put in, if she was making a pumpkin pie, she would just use pumpkin and a couple of eggs and maybe some brown sugar and spices, and she made it. She stirred it all together, and if and it would taste it, and if it needed more sugar or if it needed more spices, she would add to it. And the same thing with making a crust for a pie. She would just use Crisco and flour. And so a lot of the receipts or the recipes that people used were just something that they had in their mind that they learned from their mother or from their grandmother. And so a cook could um, add to or take away from a dish and make it her own design.
Um, Another thing that I wanted to mention is pretty much all the photographs in the book. You're in period clothing, and I was really impressed with the authenticity of you know your dress and what you used. You might talk about that a little bit.
Sure. The pictures in the book are places that I have cooked, many of the log cabins or houses or hearths where I have been able to cook. And so uh, the one that you see right in front of you is at the Cleveland house. No, that's not the Cleveland house. That is that Whippoorwill. And I'm cutting up a pumpkin there. And we uh, we made a stuffed pumpkin, and it's going to cook in the pot. It's got apples and raisins, and I think it's got some sausage in it. I can't remember. There's several recipes for stuffed pumpkin, but when we're doing the cooking, I always try to use uh, authentic, authentic looking or replicas of period cookware, utensils, and that goes for the clothing too. All of my clothing is either linen, some of it's cotton, but most of it's linen or wool. And in this particular picture you see, that is cooking an apple pie this is at Whippoorwill also, and you can see it down in the pot. That's before we got started with it. It was just, we were just getting ready to put the lid on the top.
And one of the things I remember in the book, you were talking about that you don't use an oven mitt, that you needed to use forks and things like that.
Right.
It seems like that would be an excellent way to build your muscles up because of this heavy cookware and things in it and not being able to just grab it.
Well, cooking was, it was a hard job because you did lift heavy pots. You're doing a lot of bending over. And um, it also could be dangerous. This cabin right here that you see is the Boone cabin at Whippoorwill Academy in Ferguson, North Carolina, where this cabin is located within about a mile of where the original Boone homestead was. But and I wanted to bring that out, point that out. But the one of the leading causes of death for women in the 18th century was from burns. Childbirth was first, and burns was way up there too. Now that doesn't mean, by that I'm not talking about that they caught on fire. They might have gotten a burn from on their skin, on their hand, from a hot coal, and it was the infection from the burn that was destructive, not necessarily just the burn, but the result of infection. So it was a I won't say that it was a hazardous job, but you needed to be careful. If you surely didn't want to be barefooted working around the fire, but I'm sure that probably some of the women didn't have shoes, and you wanted to make sure your hair was all tied up. You didn't want your hair hanging down into the fire or falling into the food. So you would want to wear your hair back and have clothes that was not loose and tight fitting. Getting the fire started, that is all hard work. The men could help do that, and some of the men did cook too, but you just had to work with whatever was available.
Well, it looks like we're about out of time. Is there like 1 minute that you would like to kind of sum up about your book?
Well, I would like to invite the listeners to check out this book. If you could purchase it at a online, or you could maybe check it out from the library. And I hope that you enjoy it. If you have any questions, you could get in touch with me. I do provide cooking classes and cooking workshops. Of course, right now during the coronavirus, that's a little bit hard to do, but I am open for doing that, with precaution and social distancing, or with corresponding with anybody who would like to know more about cooking, or they're welcome to get in touch with me, and they can do that through the Wilkes Heritage Museum here in Wilkesboro, North Carolina.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, I really did. Again, I enjoyed the book, and hope that other people will check it out. And I think that there's a link that they can click on. If not in what they're viewing, then you can certainly find it on the Southern Festival of Books website. I think with that, we'll probably wrap it up.
Thanks, Daryl. I enjoyed this so much. I hope you have a good afternoon.
Well, I have enjoyed it also, and I appreciate all the people who are participating in the Southern Festival of Books, and I want to remind them that to buy the books from through our site if you can, and contribute to the Humanities Tennessee to support putting this on.
Thanks.